This project has basically broken me.
I made a dark pact. In a previous video, I called out Games Workshop and I did not expect them to respond.
However, if you'd like to prove me wrong, I'd happily eat humble pie on this one. Forge World, send one over. I'll paint it right. Did I mention how stunning the sculpt is on this model?
They actually sent me the Prince of Pleasure, Fulgrim transfigured himself, and I'm a man of my word. So today, I'm gonna paint a Primarch. It's tabletop time. Let's do it. So I've got to be honest, I was really excited to open up a Forge World box of a super expensive character series model realized from the novels. Demon Primarch Fulgrim is a character we've all known about for decades and is featured in many stories from amazing Horus Heresy novels to newer stuff in 40k. He's the guy that put Gulliman in the nasty coma for 10,000 years, and from the reveals, this model looks magnificent. Immediately upon looking at it, I can see that Ozpost has not been kind to the box. It has been beaten and battered. But even upon pulling out the contents, there is some bubble wrapped wings and some fairly loose fitting pieces. Now, for full disclosure, I had opened this up. One of these two plastic packets, the one is a bit more loose than it was packed. One of them is still sealed and I'll be opening that up as well. I was very excited and I had to tear it open before I got the camera out. So I'm gonna lead with a few positives. It's really, really good to see that the instructions for Forge World models have come in leaps and bounds. Even my Legion Glaive was a single A4 page, double-sided, but this is a full color-coded instruction manual, clearly labeling all the parts, where they go, and the steps to assemble Fulgrim, which is really good. The fidelity of detail on this model is also absolutely stunning. From the tiny little teeth all over him, the veins on the wings, to the embellishments on his armor, Fulgrim's glory is truly captured in this model. However, we've got something to talk about. So you watch YouTubers and have a level of media literacy. There is an inherent bias in anything everyone does. I genuinely had no idea that Games Workshop would actually send me Fulgrim Transfigured when I mentioned in a video that it would be cool for them to send me one, to prove me wrong. And I was shocked when it arrived. We are in an amazingly lucky position where we get sent a lot of free content from Games Workshop now. And while the arrangement with Games Workshop doesn't actually obligate us to use any of the products they send us, or even to talk about them in a positive light, obviously it stands to reason that if content creators rag on their product or are negative about them, or basically give them a reason not to give us product, that would possibly dry up. We here genuinely love Games Workshop. We love Warhammer 40k, Age of Sigmar. We enjoy and play all their games. But we also have an obligation to you, the viewer. I wanted to be honest in this. I'm not going to let a personal desire to continue getting sent a bunch of cool models to tabletop time get in the way of some honest points of feedback. With that said, I do think the negative train on just dumping on Forge World and dumping on Games Workshop isn't really productive, and I don't agree with a lot of it. You've got to let people enjoy their hobby. But on this particular model, I wanted to raise a few points. First of all, it is a very, very expensive character series model, and I have to say, Forge World, if you can take anything from this, I really think, out of respect to the customer, improving the quality of the packaging is really important. I understand there's limitations in manufacturing, and that's why we have these boxes. But the soft cardboard box that's been destroyed by a postal company versus the firm-sided protective boxes from the other Horus Heresy character series is a bit of a miss on this model. It's incredibly delicate and there's lots of fragile parts, and multiple of them have arrived broken. I've got horns missing from Fulgrim, parts of his hair are snapped off, and these pieces are just gone. I can only assume they've shaken their way out of the box and fallen into the bottom of a plane or boat somewhere. For a Primarch of perfection, missing half of one of his horns is kind of sad. Now, I know a lot of apologists will say it's a complicated hobby and this is the advanced side of it, and I have to agree with a lot of that. If you're buying a resin model from Forge World, you've got to expect a level of high effort. However, there are some basic things that really need to be done, such as packaging the model in such a way that it arrives to the customer in an unbroken form. I also think for a brand new sculpt, there is a lot of flash on this model, and yes, while cleaning it up is part of of the hobby, the amount of preparation work that this particular model is going to receive is surprising to me. There are quite thick parts of flash in delicate areas of the model, and it will be extremely easy to break them, such as these little areas inside the swords. And when you break a sculpt, it's a lot harder to fix it. So now I've said my piece about receiving this model, and I've let you all know the reality of it. I don't think it is up to the quality you should expect for someone paying over £175 to purchase this character series model. I do think it needs to be improved. However, I'm not going to get into discussions about value, cost, or quality, because at the end of the day, it's Forge World's business to run their business however they want, and your decision as to whether you support those practices or not. I personally prefer a world where we get the amazing sculpts that Forge World produces and you buy into that, rather than a world in which they don't make anything for us. Now, I've been honest and upfront with this, and I fully expect to take this model home over the weekend and spend upwards of 4 or 5 hours just cleaning and prepping this model. But I do have to finish and say to the Games Workshop team and to Forge World, I actually appreciate you sending it to us, potentially knowing that I was coming at it from an angle of a little bit of negativity. And if you didn't know, well, surprise to you when you watch this. Please don't stop sending your stuff, it's great. But I think we all need to be fair and reasonable on these, and there are a few things it would be really good if you took the feedback on board. We have a platform. Hopefully you hear us. And I don't think it would cost Forge World too much more to get a few more larger boxes and package things a little bit better to ensure that we receive our products not completely broken. With that said, let's build this model and just see what it looks like in person, because I have a feeling it's going to be stunning.
With all that out of the way, it's time we build this model. A Fulgrim is made up of a huge number of parts, and his coiling snake tail accounts for several of them. Now, something Games Workshop has gotten really good at doing lately, especially with their plastic kits, is hiding the seam lines when they split up their models. This allows for some interesting and slightly more difficult to glue angles that lead to a better result in the end. They've tried to do that here on Fulgrim, using his scales to disguise some of the seam lines and putting little pegs on the resin to assist in the way it glues together. Overall, this is a vast improvement on older Forge World kits, but it is not perfect. I have never encountered resin that comes out exactly the same every time. There's always slight inconsistencies, very minor, as well as flash, forge gates, areas where the resin was connected that was clipped off, and then areas where you've shaved and filed that down. Sometimes it can be impossible to get the shape exactly as it was intended by the designer. There can sometimes be these little inconsistencies where the angle you've shaved it off, for example, isn't quite the same as the CAD design, or very frequently the resin itself is warped slightly. And that's a lot of rambling to basically say that pinning this model was a nightmare. Even with the little indents that help Fulgrim glue together, there is no way this model would stand up to any light to moderate play with just glue alone. The resin elements are too fragile, the connection points too small, and the parts too heavy, just as I suspected. So I pinned together each segment of the snake's tail, as well as his torso and the wings. His arms, I believe, are too delicate and small to attempt to pin, so I'm going to leave them and trust to the glue. However, this is where the best laid plans of Games Workshop do make things more difficult. Pinning this model was the most difficult job I've ever had pinning anything. Due to the fact that all of the joints were designed in these clever and interesting ways that attempt to hide seam lines, it did mean that there were no easy, flat, or obvious surfaces and angles to drill pinning rods, which meant it was a painful process of trial and error to get it to go together correctly. However, once I had fought my way through that process, I was pretty happy with all these pieces that would all slot together and give us our Fulgrim. Now, one technique I use to tackle a model that's really big, ambitious, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it, is to select part of that model and paint it. This is usually a small test area so I can see if my ideas pan out on the actual sculpt. So to do this, I grabbed a section and started to paint Fulgrim scales in my version of the box art. Now, on today's paint job, I am going to paint closely to what the Forge World team have done. I am also using Black Library reference art as a color companion. Fulgrim is a named character and a known character in the universe with some art depictions and descriptions, and it is my personal taste that when I paint models like that, I do try and stick fairly closely to their description or their paint scheme. However, one little change I wanted to make was to make the scales slightly more vibrant and play around with pushing the tones and color saturation in a few areas a little bit further to differentiate the armor from the scales of Fulgrim. Painting these sections involved a lot of dry brushing and then meticulous line highlighting. It was tedious and took ages, but ultimately I was happy with how it came out. element that made this even harder is the fact that wherever Fulgrim's tail curves and bends, you can see the flesh that these scales actually join into underneath. Now on a reptile, this would be quite similar to the colors of a scale, but I want to kind of make my Fulgrim look like this perverse combination of human and snake. So I decided to paint these areas in a flesh tone similar to Fulgrim's body. So it would feel like these scales are protruding from almost human-like skin. Gnarly. While these did add an area of complexity, I'm really glad they're there because they help to break up all of these scales. Another thing I liked that I took inspiration from the official paint job was to do a bit of a pattern, painting some of the scales in a brighter tone of purple just to add to that effect and help break up the tail even further. For the nasty hook on the end of the tail, I melded into a dark tan human/demon flesh tone, painting the bulges on top in a sort of amber color to contrast against the greens and purples of the model. These, I believe, are like a rattle on a rattlesnake. Then I painted the curved hook in a nice sickly green. The triumvirate of colors, purple, green, and orange is one of my favorites, harkening back all the way to Evangelion Unit 1, and whenever I get the opportunity to use it, I go ham. But with the test tail done, it's time to move on to the foundations of the model. Now the Forge World base that Fulgrim is provided with is almost mandatory. His entire snake body curves around it and curls into it in such a way that it's pretty much impossible to build him not on the base. In fact, the central core of his tail is part of that resin ground piece. While this is cool for cinematics, it does mean that unless you want him fighting on Terra with that nice Saturnine clearly written on the sculpture that he's broken through, you're bang out of luck for rebasing Fulgrim. The other thing is his base also doesn't extend to the edges of the size base he comes with, which meant I had to fill out that area. To do this, I grabbed some lovely Gamer's Grass temple pieces that are in a Greco-Roman style. These look really cohesive with the designed parts already on Fulgrim's base. I also added several pieces of rock of different scales, resin, and natural basing bits, and then blended it all together with some mud texture. Now, with this done and to help blend the base and Fulgrim into a really seamless piece of art, I established some undertones in the dirt. I used the same tones as the model would have, greens and reds, mottling them through the brown. Then I used several earth-colored dry brushes, building up some highlights and mostly covering up those undertones. For all of the stonework sections, I painted them in khaki and then hand painted a marble technique. To do this, you simply get thinned down grays and run them in thin lines across the stonework. You do a similar step with a sepia color paint, adding a second layer of wash into all of the creases and recesses to accentuate them. Once this is done, it looks a bit ugly, but the final step pulls it together, and that's a line highlight on every edge with a nice bright bone color. I'm really happy with how this marble turned out, and I think it sits as a nice neutral base for Fulgrim to rest on. There are some other elements on here worthy of painting, in particular Imperial Fists Marines, and I decided to paint the helmet with the laurel wreath as a veteran using the black with yellow stripe to represent something a bit different for those Imperial Fists. It was interestingly the first time I've ever painted an Imperial Fist or any element of Imperial Fist's armor, and I've got to say they do look good dead. With the base complete, before I could enjoy the satisfaction of gluing things together and starting to see Fulgrim come to life, I had to finish that central torso piece and finished out all the scales on the base component of Fulgrim, but now I had to paint the armor on the front of his model. Now, interestingly here, I want to talk about my love-hate relationship with metallic paints. I find that there's a bit of a painting journey we all go on, and I'd been on a journey where I had been doing non-metallic metal pretty exclusively for a while, but for some reason I've come back to metal. I like to do both in certain areas, but I found that by using sort of true metallic metals, multiple tones of metallic paints, darker and brighter, you can actually get some really wonderful effects. So I used 3 different gold tones on the trim of Fulgrim's armor, and I think they've come out looking really rich and vibrant. In particular, the lovely paints from Scale 75 in their gold set have been wonderful here. The center of the armor I painted in similar purples, however I did lean towards more of a lilac, as opposed to the deep royal purple of the scales. There's some leather straps I painted in a fairly neutral grey, a bunch of those nasty teeth and horns which I painted to match the tail in that nice black to venom green, and then a strange demonic faceplate that goes on the front of his armor. Once I'd picked out all of the highlights on the gold and was happy with how that was looking, I could enjoy the satisfying moment of gluing the tail sections together and finally having a part of Fulgrim that I could hold in my hand and see finished. I'm exhausted. I've spent the whole weekend painting this model, and the enormity of the task is kind of ridiculous. There's a huge challenge in painting these Horus Heresy character series models. They're intricate, they're wildly expressive and amazing, but one of the unique challenges faced by content creators is the very short turnaround we get to paint them. Yeah, you could say I'm tired, and hope is at a low right now. There's an opportunity to be part of a Warhammer community article, and as someone who's loved Warhammer my whole life, every time that comes up, I am like really enthusiastic to do that. But the deadline is today. And as of today, remembering that my full-time job is creating YouTube videos, we've had other videos in the pipeline, other work that we've been working on. I've had the Fulgrim model for 9 days at this point. I don't know if that sounds like a lot to you, but if you're painting a character series Primarch model in basically your free time, it's a lot. So all I've basically done is paint this model, and I'm exhausted. It's so good. It's really cool. I'm so glad I'm done the scales and I'm ready to move on to the upper body. Can I finish it today? Almost certainly not. Am I going to miss the Warhammer community deadline to get this article in? Almost certainly. Is it okay? Yeah, I guess. It's a bit disappointing, honestly, especially when I'm actually really proud of how this comes along. I don't often get the time to paint like showcase models, and this still isn't really like a competition piece. I'd say this is like high standard painting for a Warhammer painter, not a competition painter. But I wouldn't enter this in a demon. Like, no way. That like every scale needs to be meticulously blended. It's a high-end paint job for an amazing model. I just wish I had another week and I could show the world how awesome this thing is. And I don't think I'm going to, but I am. Because I'm very lucky. We have a platform, we have this video, you're watching it. While I probably didn't make a Warcom article, at least it does get to be seen. And yeah, that's where we're at. I'm kind of hopeful that the bulk of like the really tedious work in painting all the scales is done. I've got the upper body to do, and by surface area, there's actually a lot more, but with fleshy wings, I might be able to come up with some tricks and paint a lot of that skin in a much simpler way. I will say this model is exceptionally fragile and it's terrifying to work with. It breaks a lot. I'm glad to sort of have a foundation to now start gluing off and building off in the tail. Yeah, it's time for me to settle in and basically prep the upper body. My plan was always to do these sub-assemblies. I'm keeping the wings off. They're just going to be too cumbersome, but I am going to build all the arms and the torso and then glue the torso, arms and head, and then we'll glue the wings in. And yeah, that's going to need some puttying to fill the seams later, but I'd rather putty and repaint that blend area than have to paint all those forearms and head and hair with these giant wings in the way. It's time to build that torso, so let's do it. I'm exhausted. I'm genuinely wrecked. I think I painted for like 16 hours yesterday and I'm getting sick. Before I finished up assembling the top of Fulgrim, painting him up in the wings, I wanted to fully complete him from the waist down. And to do that, I needed to include his little belts and tassets. There's 2 cloak sections on his back and a strange grinning demon face for the front of his torso. For the grinning demon face, I painted all the same steps as the armor, the golds, and also the purples, but I just highlighted them up to much closer towards white, pushing those lavender tones in the highlights even further to make this part stand out. The demonic eyes, I wanted to bring back the orange tones and bounce them off the tail, which is in the same line of sight. So I made sure to paint some really vivid orange eyeballs, highlighted up to a yellow. And for another tone of green, and to keep the model on the same color palette, I painted the large gemstones in more of a primary color green than the venom green of the tail. For the back sections, rather than introducing more clashes and contrasts, I went for burgundy, taking only a half step away from purple to create this rich and regal looking coat. The flayed skin faces were a joy to paint, although they were a nightmare to clean the resin off. These sections also include a huge number of feathers, and I decided to paint these an exciting vivid green with some little blue peacock-like dots at the end of each feather. And I did this to create a really vibrant pop of color around the midsection of the model from behind. Now I wanted Fulgrim to have a vaguely fleshy but still pink and purple tinged skin tone, reflecting his vanity and humanity with his new nature as a demon of Slaanesh. Already pushing my time limits beyond their limits to paint this model, I knew I would need to come up with a method for painting the wings that got a good result, but didn't take tens of hours. I decided to use dry brushing, using a good quality Artist Opus dry brush. But to do this, I needed a foundation. All of Fulgrim's skin I painted in Vallejo's heavy warm gray, and then I picked out all of the veins in a bright turquoise. Now it's okay to go this bright because all the dry brushes are going to dull it back and make these look like those bluey veins underneath the skin. After this step, we can add some warmth to the model by using a watered down Caribou Crimson shade over the whole thing. This works exceptionally well on these resin Forge World models as there's so much intricate and minor detail, the wash has plenty of places to sink into. After this is done, I mix in some of Vallejo's Nocturna Fantasy Pro highlight skin into that heavy warm gray in increasing quantities and dry brush towards the center of each of the wing membranes. 3 distinct tones helps build up a really nice effect, and overall I'm quite satisfied with this. However, the bony fingers of each arm have been left a little lackluster by the dry brush, so I do the same colors with a layer brush, picking out highlight areas such as joints and bones to really make them pop. All of the talons on the model I paint in the exact same way as Fulgrim's little pokey tail, bringing in those nice jade greens. There's some freaky faces on the back of the arms, and to make them pop a little bit more, I carefully apply watered down Druchii Violet and Caribou Crimson in various areas, just back and forthing until I'm happy with the effect of tortured skin. And that makes the wings done.
So we were meant to have this video out like over a week ago, 2 weeks ago, actually, when Fulgrim was announced. But there's something we don't ever talk about, I guess, on the internet, and that's ego, feeling special. When you love a hobby your whole life, reading White Dwarf, sort of obsessed with it, it's your big hyperfixation, and you finally are lucky enough to be in a position where you get to work with a company like Games Workshop in some way. They actually send you a really cool special kit of a character you like. There is a drive to do well, to pay respect to that, to do it justice. Not only that, we make 2 videos a week, and something we say in-house sometimes is people don't know how we can paint. People never actually get to see us paint to the full extent of our abilities because we have to paint quickly on the channel. So when I got Fulgrim, I really wanted to do something special. I knew I wouldn't be able to do like competition entry, but I wanted to do something in the middle. I wanted to put in like 40, 50 hours on a model that is way beyond the scope of most hobby painters' regular models. This is a huge model. It's covered in detail, so much line highlighting. So even doing like just a good paint job is going to be a hugely time-consuming mission. But I didn't really think about the consequences of that. So Fulgrim arrived 8 days before the embargo date. We were already filming other videos, so we had no production time to work on it until way closer to the date. And I think it's interesting because a lot of other YouTubers have talked about this. The Games Workshop, the way they send things to creators, it arrives so close to the release date that we're quite limited in the content we can create. And we want to create the best content with these cool new things. That proved pretty impossible. I actually was sick for a few days, and I believe a big contributing factor to that was working on this model. I was getting like 4 hours sleep, painting ridiculous hours just to try and get it done, and ultimately crashed and burned. And that's why you're getting this video now. And even now, I'm done. I want to say I love this model. It's really well designed. It's really cool. It's gorgeous, but it's so much. And putting yourself in the hobby pressure cooker to do such a showcase piece is huge. It's a lot. And some painters are really fantastic at it, but it's certainly outside our wheelhouse. And at this stage, I'm going to get it across the line because I have to get it across the line. But I think at home, I would have taken a break. I think that's the point we're at. I'd put it away for a couple of weeks. I'd come back to it, let the passion come back. Don't take on Fulgrim lightly. Don't take on a Forge World character series model lightly, because if you care about the outcome, it's a huge amount of work. So just be aware of that. But either way, we're almost there. We're going to press on to the end, and hopefully the outcome is worth the effort.
So I have to rally and really push through and try and get this model done. I've committed to do it. I'm really happy and excited it got sent to me, but it's just a massive project. As anyone who's painted one of these character series models would know, it feels like there's a lot at stake here, when really there's nothing at stake. The first part of the upper body I needed to paint was the skin, as well as it was the lowest area. But due to the intricacy of the model, I couldn't use dry brushing. So instead I opted for the same techniques, but with layer brushes. Now, as I've not painted a huge huge amount of skin in my career, I'd consider it one of my weaker areas. I've spent a lot of time painting power armor and robots and not much time with dudes outside that armor. So I asked Murray for some advice, and he suggested using a really thinned watered down glaze of blue, especially focusing towards the lower parts of the arms, and then redden it up with a nice soft glaze of red once that was dry. Initially, I was really nervous about doing this, unsure as to how putting blue on this would affect it, but ultimately I'm really happy I went with his suggestions. You'll also notice here I've left the face. That will be the very last thing I do because I'd hate to lavish detail and attention onto it and then muck it up with a stray paintbrush. Once the arms were complete, I could move on to the torso, painting all of these armor panels in the exact same way as his lovely snake belly armor, using gorgeous Games Workshop purples trimmed with those amazing Scale 75 metallics. And as you can see, he's coming along really nicely. So the absolute final deadline for this video is tomorrow. I mean, it was today, but I've pushed it back another day, but we can't anymore. It has to go out. But I don't want to compromise on this paint job. So at this point, that means I'm taking Fulgrim home and I'm going to go to sleep when I finish. Oh, it's going to be a long one, and we're just going to cut through some stuff. So I'm sorry that we couldn't get the full paint job on camera, but all of the accessories and weapons I'm going to have to whip up tonight, and then we can enjoy some gorgeous reveals. Feels good to be close to the end, but this really is, yeah, it's the slog. So wish me luck. Wish me luck.
I'd like to give a massive thank you to our patrons. If it wasn't for you, we couldn't make the videos that we do. You're the people that fuel my 3 a.m. painting of Fulgrim the night before a release. If you'd like to join our Patreon and see what we're up to and chat about videos after the fact, we put out a weekly behind the scenes update where we talk about what's going on in the studio, how videos are performing, our feelings about that, kind of give you that inside look to YouTube, as well as doing a monthly mini review. So there's heaps of cool stuff there if you're interested. If not, just watching the videos is a big help, so thank you everyone. Thank you so much for watching the video. We're about to go shoot reveals, which you've already seen, and I'm putting the final touches on Fulgrim. It's been a huge adventure, and I'm honored to have been sent a model that's really special by Forge World. I know they don't actually send out Primarchs to many people, so for that I'm thankful. But oh my gosh, this has been probably, honestly, the hardest model I have ever built and painted from Games Workshop. It's extremely detailed. It is gorgeous, don't get me wrong, but I will give a word of warning to people who paint it because it's something I discovered in these final steps. This model begs to be assembled before you paint it. The pieces, the wings, the arms, the torso fit so specifically, and as soon as I had set all my pins and everything worked perfectly, of course nothing fit when I went to actually assemble the model. So there's some gaps and unsightly things I'm not too happy with, and now I have to go and putty them and then paint over that. It's a whole nightmare. But I will say I don't think you could paint this model once you've assembled it without it being a nightmare itself. Even just doing these final dot details is really difficult. So word of warning, when they say expert model kit, I think this is the top of the range. I've built 5 Titans from Forge World, and this is harder to build than a Titan. Less forgiving and more detailed. Definitely more detailed. If you've enjoyed this video, thank you. Please like and subscribe. And yeah, I'll think twice before calling out Games Workshop to send us stuff. Unless you want to send me Exodus. Exodus? Yeah, the Alpha Legion character, Exodus. Yeah, I'd love one of them. Cheers. That was a terrible wink. That was so awkward. I'd love one of them, Forge World. Cheers. Don't do that. No, give me the take back.